It pains me to make a recording like this. I'm going to title it something like Noam Chomsky pseudo-intellectualism in his dotage. You can see the false dichotomies that Noam Chomsky lays down all over the place. So he classifies the Trump management or the Trump style or the Trumpian style of politics in the treatment of Corona as being essentially beyond the pale, because all the people that won the votes are people that were cavalier with COVID restrictions or something like that, were laissez-faire. Uh, to put it in the hands of private interests or private power was essentially the implication there. I think he used the word private interest as if the personage of the citizen is not the rightful private holder and the administrator of such things, that somehow public health is an authoritarian, infantilistic sort of domain that must be regulated by some kind of unaccountable centralized power and authority. And then when he contrasts that to the democratic platform on something like climate change, he says, well, they're aiming at something real. So somehow the left is always aiming at something real, and essentially the right's uh, proclivity to wish to hand responsibility and accountability and liberty and power on the individual scale um, is irresponsible and risks life. So you've got this false dichotomy of safety, of a kind of a safety idolatry or something like that. That you on the spectrum of who is promoting the safety of the population. I mean, this is an inexcusable sort of collectivist conflation of everything, compacted into a single, uh, quite unjustifiable polemic, I would say. I mean, this is so out of date and out of place. You can see the out of placeness of Noam Chomsky's trajectory. You know, what was happening in Vietnam, and I would caution that we don't even know what was really happening in Vietnam, although that's a bit of a conspiracy theory. Um, I don't think the Truman Doctrine makes sense in terms of the amount of Western powers that concentrated into Vietnam, but this is a separate issue, and I don't want to. That's a bit of a radical thing for me to get into, but anyway, let me just put that aside. I will just say that on the face of it, Vietnam was an unjustifiable war, and it was so unjustifiable, and let's say revulsion to it was clamped down so exactingly that to me it smacks of something much deeper. I mean, do you really think it's? I mean, is that really just the military-industrial complex trying to justify the expense of weaponry so that some shadowy political power in the corner can be satiated or something like that? Is that really what's going on there, or was there something? I mean, there are lots of layers of conspiracy to do with that, perhaps. Anyway, and I'm not so keen just to throw the West under the bus on that, because who knows what was really happening. Um, and again, I know that this is very I'm 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 essentially I'm pleading my ignorance that I don't know what I don't know, as it were, or I can't justify. But so essentially, I would say that it was certainly a noble thing to stand up against that at the time. Um, but let's just say I think that the world has changed its quality to a large extent. The legacy of these things has civilized the West further. But the idea that you can get more out of essentially blindly, willfully being unseeing in just basic sort of facts, that essentially, that the Republican establishment is just to be regarded as being irresponsible or something like that. I mean, there was an insinuation right at the beginning of this Noam Chomsky uh, uh, video on the Stoa called "The Responsibility of Intellectuals" with Noam Chomsky. That's what I address my critique to now, which was at the start, which was somehow that the Republicans were doing badly, or Trump was doing badly for the American people, for minorities, or I can't remember. I should probably find the exact sort of quote, but it was at the build up for this. I mean, I think is the idea that Breitbart and these other media establishments live in a different universe. That is correct. They do live in a different universe. That's exactly correct. They do. They live in a more real, pragmatic universe in which, conservative in some sense means what you can actually see with your eyes. So to say that, oh, well, they live in a different universe, and therefore it must be the wrong universe to live in, that we are unknowingly aiming at the right thing that's real, and they are living in a false reading of the times, or something like that. When if you look at record black unemployment, you look at the real economy and how it has stabilized and picked up under Trump. All of these things. I mean, if you look at Joe Biden, I mean, it's somewhat disgusting that essentially he never campaigned on his own platform if he did have a platform. It was a completely negative campaign, and he talks about democracy. I mean, this is, unjustifiable. I mean, this is the contortion and the manipulation orchestrated by a whole slew of pseudo-intellectualism that is essentially so invested in its own hyper-partisanship and its own false dichotomies. This is the meaning of simp. That the narrative is simplified extremely. This is sophistry, and I will say that Noam Chomsky made a huge intellectual contribution when he defeated behaviorism. He set back psychiatry and psychology for a generation, but now they have infiltrated the so-called expertise of the intellectual edifice. I'm only at around the 17-minute mark in this 1 hour sort of recording. But I mean, what is already plain for me to see is just the extent to which the polemic is unjustifiable. The polemic is essentially translucently willful self-ignorance. So I'll put that as a sort of as a single claim against what's going on. But let me say something more about Noam Chomsky. That he certainly he delayed the onset of, let's say, he's been fighting postmodernism for all his days, but his political reductionism, or his political platform, as it were, is itself guilty of more egregious things at this point than what his polemic. His polemic is based essentially on believing in the climate science, when even the people who literally invented the models, who literally designed the actual calculus that makes the computer models, says that this is a bunk field. And then if you look at how the money power has invested into essentially creating a huge perverse incentive for this kind of climate stuff, I mean, you can't be published because you're told that you're being irresponsible if you argue against the consensus. This is everything becomes simplified. That you can rely on a boogeyman, on a story narrative of a boogeyman, to use your false dichotomy to suggest that you're on the right side. And these are hypothetical claims that Noam Chomsky is making. They are fucking embarrassing. They are simply beyond his stature in his own legacy. Yes, he says the right thing about big business, shady interests and things like that, and then he chalks that up as that he's on the right side of it. Why isn't Trump on the right side of that? And Trump was actually improving the real economy. You have to, people, there's a willful blindness here, which is somewhat disgusting. And, just because you say these people that go to these media, they live in a different universe. Well, why isn't that the correct universe? You see? Why isn't the balance of reality and truth in that universe and devoid in your own? Especially when you use such flagrantly convenient metrics, and it's. Noam Chomsky used linguistics to, let's say, break and stymie the psychological, psychiatric establishment's, let's say, cultural devolution, which is now in full swing, which Noam Chomsky now is not really able to see that he himself is in breach of the wonderful arguments that he made originally against Foucault, um, because he has now become susceptible to his own reductive behaviorism in some sense, which is essentially safety seeking, as it were. So much so that the liberal individual does not factor into. I mean, he's a bit of a vanguard Leninist at this point, which again is uncharacteristic of his own intellectualism in his heyday. So it's I understand that he is here and he is proffering answers to questions because there is truth in what he says, but it's sadly he is somewhat past his sell-by date, and perhaps he should enjoy his retirement. But it at least needs to be tempered with some kind of self-reflective. I mean, so he says the duty of an intellectual is to speak the truth and to point out lies. That's not good enough, actually, because to speak the truth, okay, well, who's to say what is true and what isn't true? Those are just truth claims. And then to point out lies. Now, that is not a coherent platform. That is not a coherent, because essentially then that requires a kind of fiery debate. That requires critique and answer to a critique. So I would have Noam Chomsky respond to the points that I have made. That is he not just safety seeking? In the confection of things, is he not prone essentially to these legal arguments that come from the Democratic side of the aisle so much, that the Republicans are playing fast and loose with the legal structure? But you have to understand that the legal structure in America is the root of the problem. The legal system in America is trial and error on the substance of the law, because it comes from the legislature. And trial and error on the substance of the law is not the rule of man. Is not the rule of law, it's the rule of man. Or it's not a justifiable way to rule man. I mean that so essentially the rule of law in America essentially boils down to due process, which is, again, that's it. So yeah, you've got some wonderful procedural law in America, and then try go up against someone who's got a bank account. You'll never win. They'll exhaust you. And if you go before a full bench, it's in order to get some kind of expediency, then you're up against their rationalization of the precedent, which they cannot make new precedent in those fora. There are no high courts in America. There are only magistrates' courts. There are only courts of creatures of statute. All the courts in America are essentially creatures of statute or the Constitution, and they have no substantive backbone in them. You don't have real constitutional rights because they don't lead to real remedy. There's no right without a remedy. There are no true remedies in America, because the remedy itself is trial and error, is the legal test. You don't have a principled general formulation of actions and of the remedy attached to the action. Unless you have a general formulation in principle of those things that are somewhat permanent, which you can only get from the last existing vestiges of the Roman substantive law, which exist in my country. But anyway, America is prone to the Napoleonic corruption because you rebelled against King George and you tried to follow the French. And you have a French model of a democratic failure. And this is why all your rights in the Bill of Rights are in the amendment section, they're not in the body. It's a cock-up. And the American culture and soul has been poisoned because of it. And so you live in a culture of goats, essentially. And essentially you can just make up whatever rationale you want to put up a wall. there's no such thing as justifiable reasoning in American society. I mean, the only live players in some sense are intellectuals that are willing to punch back and forth, and now you've actually created the real true sons of liberty, these SJW, sort of contrapoint sort of people where it's like, I'm not interested in arguing. I'm not interested in having a rational debate. There's no such thing as rationality. It's whoever controls the legislature controls the morality. You've got a very dangerous society. The chickens have come home to roost. And I must say, the willful blindness to not self-dissect, to not self-appreciate that essentially America is ruled by an unaccountable sort of shadowy money power, and you can't blame any of the politicians for playing the dirty tricks that they play, and I would even say that the Republicans play it better than the Democrats do, because the Democrats use lawyers and legalism to contrive things that are supposedly aiming in the right direction, and the Republicans just play the game within the boundaries, and they don't try to overextend them. I mean, you can see this in terms of how Trump was essentially impeached by the Congress. I mean, absolutely disgusting. I mean, so Congress is actually functioning as a fucking high court. I mean, this is beyond civilization. This is literally the rule of man. And then you want to come and influence other people's legal systems. And yes, you have some very nice procedural law. You really do. The, what do they call it? The disposition, the deposition way of collecting evidence and things like that. I mean, but it works within the structure and the system. But essentially, you can understand that because of depositions and such, it puts the balance of power in the people that have money. Essentially, you cannot extract justice from someone who has a larger bank account than. I mean, look, I'm generalizing. Obviously, somewhat in the middle ground. Maybe you'll have an even, but it's still a coin toss. It's the whole thing is because the president itself, you have no courts of record. You have courts that keep records. It's not the same thing as a court of record. A court of record, you can see how far the rabbit hole goes, because you can literally, you have to justify everything from the ground up from principles, and you can challenge everything, and you can challenge jurisdiction, and you can build up the case from a principled framework, from nothing. That's the value of a court of record. There are no principles in American law. There is only the fiat of the legislative body or the framers of the Constitution, which don't have clear remedies attached to their rights. So essentially their political rhetoric. The whole thing is a charade. The whole thing is a game. And it's baked into the culture. You've got the Napoleonic corruption baked into the culture, and now the chickens have come home to roost, and now you still want to have I mean, look, I can understand that Noam Chomsky, he wants something better. I also want something better. I mean, but I think that it's possible to do it within the, let's just say, a reform of the state to some degree. I mean, I don't think that you can have a kind of. I mean, I'm very inclined even to Noam Chomsky's basic model of anarcho-syndicalism, but I think that you have to do it within the legal structure, and you should do it harmoniously with your neighbors. But essentially, you would have a problem with that because of the secret polices in America. The federal structure of the legal system in America is just beyond. I mean, this is why you have right now a constitutional crisis, which someone should be jumping on top of. And without that, you are going to continue this never-ending story of this, is it the economic system? Is it the political system? Do we need to remove money from these things? Is it a journalism problem? And those are, I would argue, all symptoms of the same major crisis, which is, it's a constitutional crisis which has now essentially peaked. It has now become ripe and visible, and these so-called intellectuals can't even see it because they do not understand the confection of their own founding inadequacies that they have tacitly grown accustomed to in their Napoleonic corruption of their half-baked culture, as it were, because they cut themselves off from their own culture when they should have been learning what was happening with King George and the Parliament and the House of Commons. Instead of actually looking at the House of Commons and learning the lesson that King George and his politics that was going on there, they said, "Ooh, just taxation without representation. We know for a fact that there's something to that. Let's actually uh, um, see how we can kind of, sit with that." Or so. And who knows what King George was dealing with? This is the thing. When we're dealing with sovereign powers, we don't know what's going on in the background. Again, there are secrets, there are stories that no one knows about, and who knows if even the conspiracy theories that come out are the true secrets, And so this is the problem, is that when we have secrets in society, then we have a lack of transparency, and there's certainly a lot of lack of transparency in America. So I would say getting involved in anything other than fixing the transparency problem is essentially, you will the ends, but you don't will the means to the ends. You are in pursuit of trial and error. I mean, it's a never-ending circus, and this is why I despise the American system, I would say, and I despise the American culture to a large degree, and I mean it works within some bounds. I mean, look, you can say that this was precipitated also because of immigration, because of general culture in the world, because of these academics, which, in the McCarthyist era were cleansed, these kinds of malcontented academics. And this is the contradiction, is that, well you're infringing on these people's freedom of speech and such. But it's a necessary infringement. But the form that the rights take, they have no practices built into them. They have no remedies built into them. They are just rationalizations. You are ruled by the moral supremacy of the legislative houses in your states. It is unjustifiable. It is an encroachment on the individual. The citizen has no dignity in the American system, and this is the defect that poisons everything. And I would even say it has poisoned Noam Chomsky himself in his intellectualism, which has now ripened into full-blown pseudo-intellectualism. And even what he says is not correct. Is not incorrect. It's weird because he is telling you what he thinks is true, and he is pointing out lies. And he does point out lies, so that's great, and he does tell you what he thinks is true. But between those two things, it's somewhat a rock and a hard place. It's how do you know that there aren't false dichotomies there? And I can only suggest that I have pointed to more than one. But we have a disaffected generation that is now used to the strategy. In fact, they have been adopted by the Noam Chomskyan sort of rationale, which is converging towards something we know not what. And there is a willful blindness into continue the progress. And the conservatives sit back and say, let's just look at the actual fruit of this enterprise. And should we really continue with these transgender pronouns? Is that really helping our children if we give them drugs to change their gender identity, to help them with their new confusions that have been confected by your psychology and psychiatry, big-worded people who think supposedly to be experts, because we don't have any legal means to push back against this, because our morality is dictated to us by our legislative houses. And so these are the sons of liberty. And the Democrats are just as symbolically patronizing of their own. You see now the new breed of the supposed liberal intellectual underground. They are more. They care more about the niceties than the well, at least then I would say that I'm on the side of Milo Yiannopoulos, essentially. That's my breed of intellectual, as it were. Although, perhaps he jokes around a bit too much, and I'm prone to psychologize things perhaps a bit too much, which obviously doesn't make a great general polemic about society. But, my general polemic about society is find out what the root problem is and deal with it, instead of fighting the symptoms of the problem. And sadly, the root problem are the people themselves that have been enculturated in a legal. The legal system becomes the culture eventually, essentially. And that is what has happened, and it has poisoned all of you, and you don't even know an alternative because you will not listen to what's going on across the pond. You will not look at, I mean, in fact, you poison us. I mean, my country was destroyed by American agents and by legal scholars that you sent here to teach legal positivism to people that were, frankly, affirmative action judicial officers, to be poisoned by thinking that there is such a thing as a kind of as a governmental prerogative, which is wholly imported from your foul and disgusting legal tradition, which is completely baseless and trial and error, which is the rule of man, which is no rule at all at the end. It's the rule of might makes right. It's the rule of pure power. And this is the politics that now you play, and you still don't see it as a symptom of a greater cause, which is that you rebelled too early, perhaps because of lawyers, and perhaps because of people that saw it, that revolution is a path to advancement. And this has been the characteristic motif, the theme that has threaded the whole of the American system, which is essentially, oh yes, our legal system is wonderful because we can claim punitive damages if we find the right person who has just enough money to pay the punitive damages, but not enough smarts to get like a lawyer to kind of play the tricks of the trade. And so it's a quick get rich scheme, essentially, is something like the American dream. And then when somebody else overseas is got a system of governance, has got a system that is superior, then you feel greedy and jealous, and your secret agents say, oh, you're doing something communistic or something like that, because everything must be in the image of yourselves, and your own corrupt, putrefied, frozen stasis, which will now is clear to see. The constitutional crisis is very clear to see in America. You don't have real substantive law in America. The principles of legality are not met because essentially it's just legislative fiat within some strange bounds within constitutional rights, which are really not rights, because they are just rationalized to be in line as much as possible, because the judicial officer is not there to protect the individual citizen. He or she is there to protect. I don't use the plural pronoun for when I'm talking about an individual. I find that to be an egregious abuse of grammar. And in fact, I think that it is fundamentally dehumanizing, because it is to say that someone can represent a collective as well, and therefore gives them a different kind of force in the practice of equality, and which is very poorly misunderstood right now, because everything gets confected into a polemic. But okay, I'm somewhat spiraling into tangential offerings of other sort of things, but I should actually make a recording on why equality is not a right. It is a practice that deals with how you treat other rights, essentially, and how you limit other rights within certain contexts and things like that, which is the mechanism that actually exists within the South African Constitution, but which the jurisprudence has been institutionally corrupted because of the institutional corruption in the ANC in relation to the state, in relation to the parliament. You can't have a Congress inside a parliament, essentially. But anyway, these are vague headings, so let me not speak too sparsely on so many different, very complicated matters. Anyway, I think I've made the point as concisely as I can make, and I almost don't want to continue listening to this. So I mean, I guess I got it almost 17 minutes in the responsibility of intellectuals with Noam Chomsky.